Welcome back. It seems like we have a nice full house despite some rather delicious lunch yesterday. Dinner, sorry, and I don't know what you did afterwards, but I'm glad that you're back here in this very room. The second day of the Heinrich Dialogue 2025. This morning we do how do you call it best? We have a traditional perspective on the Heinrich Dialogue, meaning we do start the day off with things with our well-beloved ambassador panel. We follow up with the Heinrich scenario and the Heinrich hero. People who have been at the Heinrich Dialogue before know these kind of events, but I think, as I said, it's a tradition and a well-established tradition. The only non-traditional thing when it comes to the ambassador panel this morning is that I'm not Arne U. Holm, the editor in charge, or former editor of Heinrich News, who did moderate the ambassador panel in the previous years, but I try to be less strict than Arne. People who know Arne is like that he couldn't have very punchy questions. I'm an academic, so I can be more fluffy in that regard. That having said, just one thing on the emergency exit for people who haven't been here. Exits, you know how they look like. Please follow those in case there is something called an alarm. Other than that, ambassador panel will last for an hour, and then we'll go into a break, and afterwards we have the Heinrich scenarios and the Heinrich Hero Award, and then we'll continue with our program. I guess that's having said, let's start with the ambassador panels. As you can see, our ambassadors have already been seated. I will quickly introduce them. I will start with an intro question, and then I'll follow up a bit, but I would really like to open the floor to all of you. So think already about some questions you want to raise to the ambassadors here and try to be interactive, and we hope for a rather interactive session. That having said, let's start with the panelists of today. To my very left, we have the ambassador of Finland to Norway, Teemu Tanna. Teemu, welcome. Next to him, we have the ambassador of the United Kingdom to Norway, Jan Thompson. Jan, welcome. Then the ambassador of Sweden to Norway, Mikael Eriksson, welcome. And then we have from Norway and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Heinrich coordinator and still chair of the Sustainable Development Working Group of the Arctic Council, Inga Nyhammer. Welcome to all of you. And now I get seated. So what we have been discussing yesterday in the first panel on security, and what we also want to do here is we are well aware that the High North is under pressure, that the international order as we know it is under pressure, and not only since the events of February 22, even before there has been changes in a broader thinking of what the international order is. We have new superpowers around the world that become more active in areas, in spaces where they have not been that active, and the High North, the Arctic, is one of them. Obviously, I'm thinking about China, but also more increasingly about India and others. Then, of course, we have the events of February 22. We are all aware of them and all the changes it brought to the European order, it brought to the High North, it brought to the Arctic. And of course, most recently, we got a new old president in the United States who also has some rather disruptive statements from time to time. The idea of this ambassador panel is really to have a broader look on these changes in the international order. And so my intro question to all of you, and I hope you have a few minutes to reflect on this question from your country's perspective, is really, if we are in a time of change, in what the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said a few years ago in a Zeitenwende, in something really that is, at least for my generation and for our generation these days, different to what we have experienced in the end of the Cold War, a rather peaceful Europe, a rather peaceful Arctic and High North. Is that about to change? And if this is about to change, how are your country's perspective on that, both global change, but also the impact of the global change on the High North, on the European Arctic, on this part of the world? Maybe Teemu, I will start with you.
Yes, thank you very much. To that question, I always remember a famous American baseball philosopher, Yogi Berra, who has said, and I paraphrase him, that the future, or the present and the future ain't what it used to be. And I think this describes very well the situation now. So how do we sort of face these challenges that you mentioned, I think it's not worth of bemoaning. It's not also or neither a moment of embellishment, but you have to really face the realism as it is. And of course, what is important is that we take concrete actions. I think this is the Finnish viewpoint. A few examples. I mean, the Russian war on aggression. Of course, we are now have entered sort of preliminary peace negotiations. But what we need to do is support Ukraine, both militarily but also in this peace process. So that is very, very important. And I think we are all countries present here doing that. So concrete action is very important. And also what we have to do is we have to rearm in Europe. So at the same time as we support Ukraine, we have to develop our capabilities. And as that process is ongoing, if you look at what has been done on the EU level, there are already pledges for 800 billion euros. Of course, there are loans, but also an instrument of 150 billion. We see what is happening nationally. I mean, the German, very courageous decision now on 500 billion investment. We are all doing, I think, Sweden yesterday announced, UK has also announced, and so are we. So we want to move further. We are already, as Finland, at 2.4% GDP in defense expenditure, but I think we'll go beyond that. And why? Partly, of course, to share burden with the US, but of course we have to keep in mind that Russia will be a threat for Europe also in the future, despite of what happens in Ukraine. And of course we have to strengthen the defense industrial base in Europe. That is a key question also. Our NATO membership, Finland, Sweden, of course, strengthens the security in Northern Europe. And from NATO we will soon have regional plans, then we will implement them. We have joined the Norfolk headquarters, so I think that is moving in a very good direction so that we can strengthen defense and deterrence in the north. Perhaps on a general point, I think we need, in Europe, we need both muscles and we need brains. Muscles, I mean, we need a broader strengthening of our economy. We have to be able to compete with the United States on AI, on quantum, on technology issues, in general. And of course we need for that education, innovation, and looking at the audience here with many students from the Nord University, I think this is a message of encouragement to them also, that keep studying, keep learning and innovating. I think that is the key to success for Europe.
Right. Thank you very much for these first few thoughts. I mean, zooming out of the Nordics now, Jan, from a UK perspective, I mean, what are your perspective on the changing order in the world, in Europe, and then also how does it reflect into the broader European Arctic from your country's perspective?
Yeah, so thank you very much, and it's really nice to be here. I was just thinking, I think it's about my 7th visit to Buda. So I'm a regular visitor to Buda, although it's my first time at this dialogue, but really good to be up here. So yes, you may have noticed that the UK is not an Arctic power, not an Arctic nation, but I think we are the Arctic's nearest neighbour. What happens in the Arctic really, really matters to the UK, as well as more broadly. And I think we are preparing and have been preparing for it to be a much more contested space. We see a lot more geopolitical competition coming these past few years, particularly now. And a lot of that is, I mean, some of that's driven by the war in Ukraine, Russian aggression, and this matters a lot to our security and to the UK security, to the security of Europe and NATO. And I think we were hearing from one of the panelists yesterday about the fact that the Russian land forces have been degraded to a very large extent, but their maritime capabilities remain reasonably intact. Their most strategic capabilities are in the Arctic and have been protected. And those capabilities threaten the UK's mainland, the UK's homeland, as well as the east coast of the US and Europe and NATO more broadly. So we do see that as really important to our security. We also see with, and also a recent development with, an increasingly fast melting of sea ice, we see the new sea routes opening up, which means lots more economic and military opportunities that a number of countries are seeing in the European Arctic, and potential for economic gain, for natural resource exploitation. All of that brings with it opportunity. It also brings challenge, it brings environmental risks. And also, as we see shipping routes, more Arctic shipping, there is the risk of more accidents, of environmental damage, of pollution. All of that is very, very relevant to the UK as the nearest neighbour of the Arctic, of the European Arctic. We're also seeing many more challenges around hybrid threats now, and the waters off Norway and the high north are host to very important energy infrastructure, subsea energy infrastructure, also subsea data cables. Those need protecting, and those are very relevant to the UK too. And we take a lot of our energy and data through those cables. So all of that means that, if you're asking me to give the UK perspective, for the UK, this region is only growing in importance with all the current geopolitical challenges we're facing and with the issues around it. And some of that, as I say, is around simple climate change. And that climate change in itself brings more interest and competition from a number of players in the European Arctic. But some of it also is the heightened security challenges that we're now experiencing.
Thank you very much, John. Now, moving on to Sweden. What are Sweden's thoughts? I mean, we discussed it yesterday over dinner. As an academic, I often hear that Sweden focuses very much on the Baltics. But you phrased it rather nicely, that the Baltics with a northern view, or what did you say yesterday? Like from a Swedish perspective, this change of order, of course, we heard about NATO membership of both Sweden and Finland, but how does your country perceive this change of
I think
relationships between states?
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. I'm here, actually, this is my first visit to Bodø, so I have 6 more to go before I reach your level. I'll come back to your question, actually, but if I may just, it's extremely difficult to say something intelligent when the world is upside down and totally unpredictable. At the same time, it's very easy to say something intelligent when the world is upside down and unpredictable, because no one can fact check you. So that's a good thing, I think. I think Temo said most of the things that I had wanted to say anyway. But what you didn't say. So in contrast to your initial statement, I have to spend a few moments on the fact that Sweden and Finland joined NATO. I mean, that's a sea change for us. And I think you will correct me if I'm wrong, but it's an even bigger change for Sweden, because a NATO membership and our non-alignment was never just a question of a pragmatic attitude towards reality. It was part of our identity. We were neutral. And for 200 years, this was who we were. And I think changing that, and with the speed with which it happened, was really something amazing. And for many of us who have been advocating silently for a NATO membership for many years, I think this is a totally new reality that we have to deal with. I think, and Tim alluded to that as well, what we have to do now, it's very much focused on security policy. I mean, our vision of the North is so much more than that, but today it really is very much about security. So we are now working very hard with what I just mentioned, the integration of our armed forces into the NATO structures. We are building up our military significantly, and at the same time we are providing support to Ukraine. So that triple challenge is really what is forming our security and foreign policy. I won't go into the numbers, but it is a significant challenge. Now, what is new in the North is, of course, that Sweden and Finland provides we provide a totally new geography up here. We talked about the term Nordkalotten, which I'm not sure if it's a term used in Norwegian, but Nordkalotten for us is really sort of the Scandinavian mainland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, in the north, and that provides a totally new game plan. That is, you have to start thinking horizontally rather than vertically. You have to start thinking about how logistics will work, not just to bring material, to bring troops, forces to Norway, but further on through Sweden all the way to Finland. I think that's a totally new thing that we have to plan for. And I think in that sense, one of the new dimensions here is, and here I come back to your question, we are connecting the high north with the Baltic Sea. Now that is one area, I think, to a much larger extent than it used to be. And this is where also the Nordic-Baltic cooperation comes into the picture. I think the Nordic-Baltic, the NB8, has become a real force within the European discussion, not only within the EU, but really as a force and as a driving force when dealing, especially with Ukraine, but also other issues. And I think to come back a little bit to what Timo said about the EU, I think what we can contribute to in this whole discussion is that we have been very consistent in saying that in order for us to secure our countries, we need to be competitive. We have been arguing together with Finland for years within the EU that competitiveness is the key, and now everyone agrees, but there are nuances, to say the least, and I think that we have been very consistent in saying that competitiveness is not about state aid, it's something else. It's a thriving industry that is competitive on the global markets. And you need that to be able to finance all the things that we have to do now, building up our own forces, helping Ukraine, etc., etc. So I really would like to highlight that, the link between competitiveness and our security up in the north.
Thank you very much. I hope and I think we will tackle exactly that topic, competitiveness and security, later today in our final session. Finally, let's go to Norway. Inga, you're soon handing over the chairship, and I assume you're relieved to some extent after 2 years of hard work. Could you reflect a bit from the Norwegian perspective, the change of order? Of course, we know what has happened over the past few years, but how does your government, your country perceive that change in addition to the work you have done with the chairship of the Arctic Council?
I mean, the work of the Arctic Council?
No, in general, you have been chair of the Arctic Council for the past 2 years in a rather changing environment. How do you reflect upon this?
I think when we reflect upon, our high north policy, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022 really meant a full stop to a 30-year experiment in really trying our very best to integrate our eastern neighbor into Western structures and also bilateral cooperation to a large extent. Very optimistic, maybe, in the 1990s, less so over the years, but still, February 2022 was the end of that. And the framework for our High North policy is very different today. Russia is seen as a threat and a challenge, and not as a potential cooperation partner, and that is a big, big difference. But if you allow me, I would like to also take up the fact that this is, in fact, not the first Zeitenwende we have seen in Nordic security policy. When I was preparing for this yesterday, I thought back to my own student days in the 1980s, and an article which was on our curriculum called The Nordic Balance. Oh. This was an article written 20 years before. In 1966 it was published, and to do justice to Arne Olav Brundtland, I tried to make a few notes. His point was that the Nordic countries' security policies in fact created a framework in that in the West you had a couple of countries allied with one superpower. In the middle you had a well-armed neutrality, and then to the east you had neutrality in the framework of a friendship treaty with the other superpower. And this created a kind of balance which meant that there was a thinned out zone of reduced tension, was his phrase. And partial disengagement on part of the superpowers in our part of the world. And this was a perspective which was lauded and seen as quite valid description of the situation in the Nordic countries. It allowed for quite a lot of Nordic cooperation in terms of social policy, in terms of labor markets, the passport-free zone, etc., etc. But it did not allow for any agency on part of the Nordic countries in terms of security policy cooperation at all. So I think for me this was a reminder that even though we have just gone through a very big change in our orientation, it is not back to the Cold War as some claim, because that was a very different situation from what we experience today. Today the Nordic countries are integrating very strongly in the military sphere and their security policies. We are all allies, and we all bring very real contributions to Nordic, to European, and international security. And this is quite a big difference, and also a huge ambition for us. The other thing I'd like to mention, and that goes more for Norway specifically maybe, is that for us, security policy goes hand in hand also with domestic policy. We talked about competition, but it also has to do with, people living in the North. The North is our home. A third of Norway's territory is in the Arctic. Almost a tenth of our population is in the Arctic. This is where people live their lives. This is where they go about their business. This is where they get educated, and all of this is terribly important also from a security policy perspective. The fact that this part of our country is inhabited, and not only inhabited, but actually has communities that are thriving, that are productive, that are pleasing to the people living here. That is a quite important political goal.
Thank you very much. Let's follow up from that the new Nordic balance. Is something like that, we don't need to academically elaborate it, but do you think from a Finnish perspective there is more integration happening on many levels, more than what we have seen in these 30 years of experiment, where everything was kind of going along anyway? So.
Yes, I mean, in my view, there's a whole new dynamic. I mean, it's starting from a genuine, of course, we've had commitment, but it's really a genuine commitment we now have in terms of security cooperation, of course, a lot of it coming from NATO in terms of the impetus, but also we can build more on NORDEFCO cooperation, which was there, but now we have a new vision and we are implementing that vision. So we will have kind of plans also from the NORDEFCO perspective. And then, as Mikael mentioned, then it's these transport corridors, which is a huge investment actually from the part of Norway, Sweden and Finland that is taking place. So that creates also sort of dynamics more broadly. And it's not only a military dimension we're talking about, it's also a civilian dimension. If you think of connections from, for example, from Oulu or Rovaniemi to the west, to Sweden, to Kiruna, to Narvik in Norway, that creates also a huge potential. And we have some Finnish companies here, and they are already benefiting from this. And the Nordic cooperation, I think that has to be also stressed, the importance of that, because there are some concrete issues there which we are now tackling, I think, more vigorously. That is the barriers between our borders. So the idea is that there would not be any borders in the future in any way in our cooperation. And I think that is now happening. There's a positive momentum. So definitely I think things are moving.
Mikael, you want to?
I absolutely agree. I think there is a new momentum. I think there is new content. I think Nordic cooperation, I mean, it's always been very important, and it has been a priority for all of our governments. But sometimes it tended to be lots of words. Of course, we have the convention and all that, and so we have always been working closely together. But I think at the political level, for some time, there was more talk than actual action. I think that has changed. And again, coming back to the slightly larger picture, I think that with the 3 Baltic states with us, I think the dynamics are even clearer. And I apologize to all Norwegians in the audience, but there is another constellation here which is emerging, and that's the NB6, which is the Nordic countries that are members of the EU together with the Baltic states. NB6 is of growing importance. It's a format where 6 countries coordinate their positions within the EU, in particular in preparations for the European Council, so meetings at the highest level. This is a new animal, and I'm just mentioning that because I don't think that has been really well understood so far.
Then,
I was just going to add another acronym into the mix, which is the JEF. So, I think it's absolutely right that we see the NB8 as well working increasingly closely together, and obviously have really stepped up in terms of support to Ukraine and defence collaboration and doing more and more. And we are working much more closely with this region as a whole, also very specifically with Norway here, of course. The JEF, for anyone who doesn't know it, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is the NB8 plus the Netherlands and the UK, and which is a kind of security grouping, comes sort of just within NATO, but kind of it's a sort of expeditionary force that can come in quickly, take decisions before the full NATO decision-making structures can come into place, and sort of set up through the UK as well. And that has been very active, particularly in the High North as well, and is likely to play an increasing role in the High North, also doing work to counter threats to subsea infrastructure. And Norway, of course, is hosting the next leaders meeting of the JEF, Joint Expeditionary Force, in Oslo in May. So that's just another very concrete example of this region coming together, but also with its weight kind of pulling in other big players for all of us to find different groupings and ways of working to adapt to some of the new challenges we're all facing.
yes, one more grouping I would like to mention. Actually, President Stubb yesterday took it up and said that there's kind of an EU plus now, which has emerged, and that is EU countries plus UK, Norway, and Iceland. And that is in the context of Ukraine. And of course, UK and France have taken a leading role in trying to steer kind of the European view in that process. But then you have also EU minus, which is EU minus Hungary and Slovakia, which are kind of difficult customers in the EU. So, I mean, there is kind of a bit of a coalition of the willing thinking now to overcome difficulties where we have to move forward, but you know we cannot just do it with the kind of lowest common denominator.
Europe is a complex animal.
Yes. And the Nordics is a complex place too, but also even geographically. We can see the whole Fennoscandia peninsula as a kind of strategic hold, stretching from the Barents Sea to the Baltic Sea. But there's also the sea to the west of Norway, which is also quite important from a strategic point of view, and with the UK on the other side of that. So working all these aspects together is a huge challenge, not only militarily speaking, but even politically speaking. So it takes a lot of activity, and that's what we're seeing now in these different strategic groupings and political discussion for us. I think it's very illustrative of having to cope with a situation which is also, you know, characterized by lots of surprises and quite quick developments.
Before I open the floor to the audience, I have two follow-up thoughts I would like to raise here. The one thing is, personally, I grew up in the center of Europe, close to the Italian and Slovenian border, so the European Union as I would say, a unique peace project is close to my heart. You know, having done Erasmus, you know, having the freedom to come here and whatever, you know, to work all around Europe. And we have seen, of course, over the past few years, you know, that the European Union takes steps back, you know, with Brexit and others, but we have seen normally more integration over all these decades. You know, with that Zeitenwende, with that change of international order, again, it's a more hypothetical question, but you mentioned competitiveness, you know, and we need to strategic autonomy, need to work more together. What do you think is the next step of more European collaboration in a broader, from a global perspective, maybe also including, you know, the UK in a way, like how can the UK be more involved again? You know, what are your country's thoughts or your government's thoughts on those questions? You know, more integration, not necessarily becoming a political union, you know, in a classic way, but even more integration in many ways. You mentioned barriers, borders, you know, which of course the single market provides less borders. So these kind of thinking. Maybe Timo, I started with you again.
Yes, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion over the years about developing the strategic autonomy, as you mentioned, as a concept. The problem with that concept is that somehow you have a feeling that it excludes the United States. And our view is that you can develop, and you should develop, European defense policy, but also keeping in mind that we need transatlantic cooperation. So we very much, you know, favor that view. So developing a European army, for example, that is not in our plans at all, or our views. Of course, EU's role in terms of supporting or rearming Europe, that is very important, that we sort of catalyze our industries, as I mentioned my introductory words. I think that is the role for the EU. But of course, in the EU treaties, we have the Article 42.7, which corresponds to Article 5. So basically, we should, you know, not forget that either. So we have to keep that in mind. But the kind of strategic view from our point of view is that the US should be on board and develop jointly the defense policy for Europe.
And I mean, the UK is a global country, you know, a nation. You know, I mean, you have a permanent seat in the United Nations, etc. So you're very important for European security at large. You know, what are your thoughts on that more integration, we don't need to go down the Brexit road and the membership road, but more this like, how can the UK be even more involved,
Yeah, and we definitely want to see that. We think the times demand more collective European security, and we've referred to some of the work that's going on now with the UK and France, pulling a number of players together around Europe, but also more broadly, Canada, others, to come and think about what can we do more to step up for our own European security. But also we are looking at developing, you've referred to the past history and Brexit and everything, but we are certainly now looking to develop a much closer relationship with the European Union in a number of areas. And I think one of the primary areas there that we are looking at and discussing with the European Union and with our partners is to try and develop a new security and defence arrangement, some kind of partnership agreement that we would have that would strengthen our collaboration, and that would include cooperation in the defence industrial sphere, where we all know we need to do more and where we can do better by doing it together. So that is something we're working at very closely and hoping to come to some conclusion on that later this year. And also, I might add, we, the UK, are also looking for a new, quite significant strategic defence agreement with Norway. Which, and I mentioned that I've been 7 times to Buda. The first time, one of the times, the last 2 times I came were with my foreign minister last autumn, who was here with the Norwegian foreign minister, and last month with my defence minister, who was here with Norway's defence minister in Buda, and discussing exactly that and announcing agreement to develop a new strategic defence agreement. And you were mentioning the waters to the west of Norway, and just as a very concrete example of the kind of how we've stepped up our effort in Norway and with Norway, the UK has been doing its Arctic training. Our Royal Marines have been in Norway for over 50 years doing their Arctic training here. That has increased over the years, but also the work that our 2 navies do in the waters to the west of Norway, countering threats from the Arctic, from the high north, from the Kola Peninsula, that has increased exponentially in the last 2 or 3 years. Norway is now the 2nd busiest country for the UK's Royal Navy in the world. That is really, really significant. That activity has really, really stepped up. So that's one very concrete example here. But for your question, yes, we are looking to develop much closer relationships in a number of areas, including trade, by the way, but also specifically defence and security with the European Union as a whole.
Thank you. Mika?
Well, if the question is further integration in Europe, I think you have to talk about enlargement. I think that's very much part of the picture. And of course, as you all know, there is a question of Ukraine, of Moldova, Western Balkans. This is going to be a huge challenge, and it's for the long term. It's not for the short term. But this is still one of the major foreign policy, security policy tools that we have within the European Union. Now, obviously, there are questions relating to our common agricultural policy, our cohesion policies, which will be extremely difficult to handle. But I think, in a way, this process is unstoppable, I think, and this is going to take place sooner or later, probably later, but it's part of this whole picture, I think.
Inga, from your Norwegian perspective.
Well, Norway is, of course, through the EEA agreement, a full member of the EU common market. And I don't think I'm very off if I say that some 70% of our trade is with the EU, another 10% with the UK. So it's very much Europe-centered. But I think, over the last years, we have been, one idea is that of European sovereignty. But more generally speaking, I think we have become very much more concerned about the resilience of our value chains, our supplies, and how to be more robust, also in taking on the huge challenge of shifting our energy structures, the green shift, because that is a huge, huge challenge that we haven't yet talked about here today. But which is also something that Europe is facing. and where the Nordic countries, again, can play a quite important role in that we have a lot to offer, both in terms of energy itself and in terms of technology, and where further Nordic cooperation also could play a quite significant role. But turning to climate change as a challenge, this is also where I would like to bring in the circumpolar perspective, because it's simply, there are issues that we need to treat in a circumpolar fashion, and that is where the Arctic Council still can play a very important role and needs to play a very important role. It's a major reason why we felt that taking on the chairship of the Arctic Council was a very important task to us. We did it at a time, we took it over from Russia, at a time when the work of the Arctic Council was at a complete standstill, and we worked over these 2 years to bring it to life, to make it productive, to make it possible again for the working groups of the Arctic Council to produce actual results and knowledge like it should. And we've managed to do so, all within the framework of the sanctions regime, which rightfully applies all across the board. It has been a quite challenging task, I must say, and we are reasonably satisfied with our own accomplishments, given the point of departure that we had.
Thank you. I think you could be.
And I just second that Norway has really successfully and skillfully steered the Arctic Council in really difficult circumstances and focused on very important sort of non-military threats also in terms of emergency response to forest fires and things like that. I think you've arranged a fine conference and also looking at the youth perspective in the Arctic. So.
The security policy is, of course, explicitly excluded from the Arctic Council. That is not what that council is about. But it is also a council working on unity. I mean, it has 8 members, and no decision can be made without 8 members being on board. It also has 6 indigenous organizations as permanent participants, and it is a unique forum. It was created in those optimistic 90s, and we would never get it again if we lost it. So that is, quite something to take.
I wanted to follow up on a point you made, because that was actually my second follow-up question is, you mentioned the green shift. I mean, and we focus now obviously a lot on security policy, military aspects, rearmament, So are we losing track of the green shift in the Nordics, in the High North, in Europe overall, because the focus is so much, for obvious reasons, on security and military aspects? Are we losing track of the importance of moving away from...
I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. What is happening in the case of Finland is that we are constructing a huge amount of wind power, for example. And that energy solution will then permit us to develop future industries like hydrogen-based industries. So I think that is moving forward very well. And everything that is circular is kind of the catchword for Finnish industry nowadays. And of course, when Mikael speaks about competitiveness, that is the competitive edge that we are looking for through the green shift and the same policy as Sweden without state aid. So, for example, our state aids on building for renewable energy are not there. So this is all sort of market-based, and it seems to be producing results in this way.
Are we moving away?
I mean, in the UK, we're definitely not deprioritizing the green transition. Partly, as Timu says, we see it as not a kind of added extra that you can drop or continue, it's actually vital to our energy security and also to our economic development and our growth. So we have, and we do an awful lot of that, we in the UK, in collaboration with Norwegian industry actually, and have done for many years. UK is a world leader on offshore wind, and a lot of that has been done in collaboration with Norwegian industry, frankly, who have huge expertise as well. So we're continuing with all of that. We've announced massive investment into carbon capture and storage, which is also an area where Norway is really strong. I think between us, we hold the majority of the storage potential in the North Sea. And also hydrogen, a number of other things. Just recently, we've lifted the ban on onshore wind that we did have. So we're developing these very, very closely, in particular with Norway, and we're also working to develop a new green industrial partnership with Norway, which we hope to announce in the next few months. So we see, to answer your question in short, we see it as absolutely fundamental to growing our economies and to providing for our energy security as well. So, no.
And also Sweden, what do you call it? Chew and walk?
Walk and chew gum.
Walk and chew gum.
Yeah.
Same time.
No, I think we have exactly the same position here, and I think that it's not only political rhetoric to say that you can do or you have to do both. I think if you listen to the industry, they're saying exactly the same thing, that the green shift is actually a competitive edge that we have, and all we need is, we need the enabling framework for that, and that's the role of governments. But I think if you listen to our industries, they will say exactly the same thing, that this is something to build on. This is where we are strong. This is where we have our edge. So there is no contradiction here.
If ever you forgot about, the necessity of the green shift, you could go to the north. I mean, this part of the world is where the temperatures are rising most quickly in the world, almost 3 to 4 times above the global average, which is very noticeable for all Norwegians following, skiing competitions and the like, or even trying to find somewhere to go to do their skiing. But that's the fun part. There's a lot less fun aspects to it. And it is a challenge. We cannot, laying the framework, yes. Opening up for industry, yes. For innovation, yes. But there are political challenges linked to the green shift as well. As our Prime Minister put it, extraction of fossil fuels out in the sea is something that people don't see. There are very few, land disputes involved, but you're burning the earth, and that is something we have to stop doing. When you bring energy production on land, wind energy or others, there are land conflicts quite inevitably, particularly because the wind tends to blow the strongest where there's lots of nature to preserve. So to protect vulnerable ecosystems, to protect also traditional reindeer husbandry, for example. That has been in many cases in Norway already. But we have to solve these conflicts because there's no going. We have to be able to find solutions that are viable. And that bring us into a new energetic era. Also, all the transmission lines, there are endless questions that also need to be solved politically and not only commercially.
Thank you. You mentioned we have a energetic audience, so I hope for a couple of questions. I see the first one here. We have a mic somewhere. A second question over there. Third, fourth. We'll be here longer. First question, please. And we know who you are, but maybe you can introduce yourself.
Michael Byers. What matters most is that I come from Canada.
Okay.
A very powerful non-European country has repeatedly threatened the political independence and territorial integrity of the Kingdom of Denmark. And the countries represented on the stage have been remarkably quiet, passive, in the face of what, in my view, as an international lawyer, is a clear violation of Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter. So my question is, why are your governments being so passive? Why is there not a strong cross-European condemnation of Donald Trump's statements with regards to Greenland. Are we just going to let this slide because we're afraid to provoke him? You're very, very supportive of Ukraine. I don't see the same support with regard to Greenland. Thank you.
Can we collect 2 questions, 3 questions, and then? Yeah, okay. Another question? We collect 2 or 3. I've seen, I think the second question came from Trine.
Okay.
We collect 2.
Trine Jonassen, Harnoth News. Putin's aggression pushed Finland and Sweden into NATO under that umbrella. Will Trump's aggression, madness, what you want to call it, push Norway into the EU and UK back?
I like that. With the Mr. Yeah, right in front of you. It was the third one.
Awesome.
Oh, sorry. You will get back to it. Okay.
Felix Tafshangia from Canada. I'm wondering if the panel can speak to the role of the Sami Council and the Sami parliaments in this process.
In what kind of process?
Sort of in the process of, first of all, in the green transition, but also in cross-border collaboration across all Nordic countries.
Right. So let's tackle those 3 questions first. Some rather broad ones on Greenland and the new old president, US, and then I think a very specific one on the Norwegian or Nordkalotten approach to the green shift. Who wants to start with?
Well, I mean, there is full solidarity with Denmark on the issue. I mean, sovereignty and territorial integrity, they are key principles which Finland supports wholeheartedly. I think one photograph at the early stages of this process spoke volumes, more than 1,000 words. That was the Nordic countries around the same kitchen table eating dinner.
In Copenhagen, yeah.
In Copenhagen. And the idea was to coordinate together with Denmark on this issue. And I think that coordination has continued. But the basic point and the basic position is very clear.
I mean, from the UK's perspective, we've been very clear that the future constitutional arrangements of Greenland are a matter for the people of Greenland and for the Kingdom of Denmark, and it's absolutely 100% clear. So I think we've been very, very clear on that. On the question, do you want me to take the question on the UK back into the... I think, I mean, obviously the people of the UK voted, had a referendum, decided to leave the European Union. But what I have been also clear on, I think, by explaining is that I do think that we do see the need for much closer collaboration with the EU and a much tighter relationship. We want to put that relationship on a much more solid footing, and I think that will be, as I said, very much inclusive of arrangements on security and defence. So I do see us moving to a much tighter relationship.
Okay.
Yes, well, as far as Greenland is concerned, I agree with Timo. I think it's very clear that we have been fully 100% behind Denmark on this issue, and I think that it's been very closely coordinated with them how to communicate. I think this is something where they are fully aligned, the leaders of our countries. It's not for me certainly to talk about Norway and the EU, but what I can say, because this I think is more or less a fact, is that if you look at developments within the EU now, what is going on, the dynamism we see is located in areas which are not covered by the agreement, by the EEA. So much of what is happening requires new agreements, new formats, and so it's going to be, I think, and this is my own reflection, I think over time it's going to be more and more difficult to manage within only this framework. But again, of course, the relationship with the EU is for the Norwegians to decide.
Inga.
To start with Greenland, I think, as my colleagues already alluded to, this has been crystal clear from the start and very closely coordinated with Denmark from the start. So both our Prime Minister and our Foreign Minister have come out publicly upon agreement with the Danes, basically, and quite crystal clear that this, alluding to breach of international law is not okay, and that the destiny of Greenland and Denmark Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and how this relationship develops in the future is down to them and no one else. So that is what they have said publicly, and I don't think it could be clearer. About the EU, I think you're very right. Very much of the dynamism in the EU today is not within the EEA agreement itself, although it's still a dynamic agreement. I think Norway now has about 100 additional treaties with the EU, one of them being a security and defense agreement, quite recently concluded, and we continue to be EU's closest friend. I think that is where it's at. The question of membership is a very thorny one domestically in Norway, and how it will go in the future, well, you can guess. I cannot. It's really difficult to say what kind of dynamism that question will take on in the future.
But from your work, I guess you can say a few words about the involvement of the Sami Council.
Yes, the Sami Council is actually an organization spanning not only Norway but also the other countries that have Sami populations, and the Sami Council is a permanent participant in the Arctic Council. The Sami parliaments of Norway and Sweden and Finland too are national, so that is different, and the Sami parliament in Norway, of course, is a consultative body for the Norwegian government on all questions relating to the Sami people.
All right. I hope you allow me for 2 more questions. We had you and the minister. Maybe we start with you in the front.
It is? Okay. Thank you so much, ambassadors. I have a question. Seeing you mentioned all these amazing abbreviations and all the amazing formats, I'm looking at kind of right now, do we have kind of not relying on big forums, and do we look at a further fragmentation of the system, and how can we avoid like doubling our resources, doubling the structure, and how can we come together and cooperate in the big forums again as well? Thank you.
What would be a big forum for you?
EU, NATO, I mean, seeing that we talked about EU minus, EU plus, and so on.
Right. And the minister there? Mr. There? Yep. Microphone is on your way.
Hi, my name is Kunling, and I have 2 questions. And the first is, what was the main factor that led Finland or Sweden to change the position of neutrality? And was this like factor pre-existing, or is it like a product of contemporary times? And my second question is, like, do you think neutrality still has value today or in the future? That's all. Thank you.
You need. Can you maybe repeat the questions?
Yeah, the first one is like, what was the main factor that led Finland or Sweden to change the position of neutrality? And the second question is, like, do you think neutrality still has value today or in the future?
All right, okay. So I think the question is what led...
Well, actually, it started in December 2021, the change, the process to change in Finland. That was the moment when President Putin demanded that the NATO should not enlarge anymore, and that NATO forces from the eastern NATO countries should be pulled out. And the kind of message was that Russia would like to create a sphere of influence, restricting countries the choice to make their own security decisions. It's already quite a famous speech that President Niinistö made on our National Day on the 6th of December, voicing that this is not acceptable to Finland. And then the polls started showing upwards in terms of NATO support, and once Russia attacked Ukraine, I think then, you know, the change was inevitable, and we applied for membership because the support had been traditionally 20-30%, and suddenly it was 60-70% and even more. So that is clear. Putin made the choice that Finland will join NATO.
Okay.
Same thing. I mean, it was a process where, as you all know, I suppose, where we went ahead together, and then for various reasons, Finland became a member before Sweden did, thanks to two members of NATO. But I'm totally comfortable in saying that it was really Finland that took the lead. We were looking very much at what was going on in Helsinki, I have to say, and I think what the president did and your then Prime Minister Sanna Marin was very much appreciated and closely followed in Stockholm. Now, as far as the bigger organizations, how do we avoid fragmentation, if that was the question? I think we really shouldn't see it as one or the other. I think that if organizations are strong, there is always room for groups of countries coming together within that format. But I do admit that you have to look at the balance, of course, and we don't want to see, for instance, a NATO where there is the perception that there is sort of a northern Scandinavian Baltic subgroup, but to the extent that we can work together in furthering the interests of NATO, I think that's not a problem. But I take your point. We have to avoid fragmentation.
Yeah.
I think for Norway, the question of neutrality ended the 9th of April 1940, when we were invaded by Nazi Germany. And Norway became a founding member of NATO right after the war in 1949. We had been neutral before that, through the First World War, for example, but it was simply not a viable concept anymore for a country with our exposure. That was the conclusion. Ever since, NATO has been, the very foundation of Norwegian security policy, and I think it will remain so in the future. But this has become a quite large organization, so I think it's only natural that, for operational purposes, for example, that you have other formats to work within that framework. But NATO will remain for us a very important organization, and not only for defense planning, but also for security policy discussion and development of concepts and understandings.
John?
And nothing on neutrality, but just on the question about I very much agree with this, that there'll be smaller groupings too. But I don't know if that was what the question was getting at. But I do think there is I think we need now the rules-based international system and the system of global governance on which we've relied for decades. We need it more than ever, but at the same time, it is under pressure from a number of directions, some of the ones we're kind of alluding to, but also just a gradual kind of erosion of trust. And it's a completely different point we haven't addressed here today, really, but this question of many parts of the world feeling that multilateral system, that system that has operated for so many years, doesn't really represent them fully anymore and doesn't reflect the realities of the world today. And we do see a kind of growing trust gap between the West, if you like, or the global South, or various players in different configurations. And I do think it's a big question, but I do think it is something we need to look at if we really want to strengthen those systems and make them more resilient for the future and more equipped to deal with the challenges we're now facing. Then I think we do need to look at how they need to be adjusted and reformed, and how we need to give a bigger voice to other players that are not currently getting their voice heard.
Thank you very much. I really also believe that, I mean, we haven't touched the trust issue, but I think that's something we have to work on and discuss even more. So, a bit over time, thank you very much. I mean, it's all about dialogue here, and our ambassadors are very accessible, so you have more questions, please approach them and ask them, and they will be very happy to answer your questions. That having said, we'll take a shorter break, 20 minutes, and then be back in here for the High North scenario session. And thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you.